The sound of power tools echoing through our Willowbrook subdivision at 2 a.m. should have woken the entire neighborhood. But as I crouched in my darkened living room, drilling out the lock cylinders on my front door, I didn't care who heard. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through. My veins, each twist of the drill bit another step toward safety. Behind me, my laptop screen glowed with the evidence that had shattered my world just hours earlier. Screenshots of Marcus's search history burned into my retinas like a brand. How to stage a household accident, untraceable poisons, life insurance claim procedures. My husband of 7 years hadn't been researching home safety. He'd been planning. My murder. The headlights that swept across my front windows at 2:47 a.m. belonged to Marcus's Honda Accord. He was 3 hours early from his supposed business trip to Portland. As I heard his key scraping uselessly against the new locks I'd just installed, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. The man who thought he could eliminate me like a fraudulent insurance claim was about to discover that Claire Davidson, digital forensics specialist, didn't go down without a fight. Through the peephole, I watched his face transform from confusion to fury to something that looked almost like respect. He knew that I knew. And he knew that everything had changed. My name is Claire Davidson, and 6 months ago, I thought I had the perfect life in Riverside, Oregon. Our house on Maple Street sat in the heart of Willowbrook, one of those planned communities where every lawn was precisely maintained, and every mailbox matched the neighborhood aesthetic. The 2-story colonial with its blue shutters and wraparound porch looked like something from a home and garden magazine. Inside, Marcus had insisted on an open floor plan that he said made the space feel larger. I realize now it also made it impossible to have private conversations or hide anywhere if someone wanted to hurt you. I'd built my digital forensics consulting business from our converted garage, turning what used to be storage space into a sophisticated tech lab. 3 high-powered computers hummed constantly, their screens flickering with code and recovered data files. My clients ranged from local police departments investigating cybercrime to corporations dealing with data breaches. I specialized in finding digital evidence that others thought was permanently deleted. The irony of that skill set wasn't lost on me now. Marcus worked downtown at Cascade Insurance, where he'd recently been promoted to senior claims adjuster after 10 years of investigating accident claims. His job was to determine whether accidents were legitimate or fraudulent, visiting crash sites and examining evidence that would either approve or deny payouts. He was good at his work, meticulous in a way that I'd once found attractive. He could spot inconsistencies in witness statements, identify staged accidents, and calculate exactly how much force would be needed to create specific types of damage. I used to be proud of his analytical mind. Now I understood it had been cataloging information for a very different purpose. Our marriage had started like a fairy tale. We met at a technology conference in Seattle where Marcus was attending workshops on digital evidence in insurance fraud. I was presenting on recovering deleted files from damaged hard drives. He approached me after my presentation, genuinely interested in how my techniques might help his investigations. Our first date lasted 12 hours. Talking over coffee, then lunch, then dinner, then drinks, neither of us wanting the conversation to end. He was charming without being slick, intelligent without being condescending, and he made me laugh in a way that felt effortless. Marcus proposed on the anniversary of that first date in the same Seattle coffee shop where we'd spent those initial 12 hours. The ring was perfect. A vintage Art Deco setting that reflected my love of classic design without being ostentatious. He'd clearly paid attention to every casual comment I'd made about jewelry over the months we'd been dating. When he knelt down, between the tables, every patron in the coffee shop started applauding before I'd even said yes. It felt like the universe was celebrating our love story. The wedding was everything I'd dreamed of. Small and intimate with just our immediate families and closest friends. We exchanged vows in Riverside's historic riverfront park, with the Columbia River providing a stunning backdrop. Marcus's family welcomed me warmly, or so it seemed at the time. Helen Davidson, his mother, had insisted on hosting the rehearsal dinner at her country club. She presented me with a string of pearls that had belonged to Marcus's grandmother, saying I was the daughter she'd always wanted. Tommy, Marcus's younger brother, gave a best man speech that brought everyone to tears, talking about how Marcus had been waiting his whole life for someone who could match his intellect and challenge his perspectives. The early years of our marriage were genuinely happy. We bought the house in Willowbrook together, spending weekends at home improvement stores and nurseries, planning our future garden and discussing which rooms would eventually become children's bedrooms. Marcus encouraged my decision to start my own consulting business, even helping me research the legal requirements and insurance needs. He converted the garage himself, running electrical lines and installing proper ventilation for the computer equipment. When my first big client, a local law firm, paid me more in 1 month than I'd made in 3 months at my previous corporate job, Marcus surprised me with a champagne dinner to celebrate. But looking back now, I can pinpoint when things began to change. It started about 18 months ago, shortly after I landed a contract with the FBI field office in Portland. The work involved recovering data from encrypted drives seized in a major financial fraud case. The publicity from that success led to more high-profile clients and significantly higher fees. Suddenly, my income was matching and then exceeding Marcus's salary. I was traveling more, working longer hours, and building a reputation that extended far beyond Riverside. At first, Marcus seemed proud of my success. He bragged to his coworkers about his wife, the cybersecurity expert who was helping bring down criminals. But subtle changes crept into our daily interactions. He started questioning my travel schedule more closely, asking detailed questions about my clients that felt less like interest and more like interrogation. When I worked late in my office, he'd bring me dinner but linger longer than necessary, reading over my shoulder or asking to see what I was working on. I attributed it to curiosity and genuine concern for my well-being. The criticism started small and seemingly reasonable. Marcus began pointing out inefficiencies in my business practices, suggesting that I was undercharging for my services or taking on too many small clients instead of focusing on larger contracts. He offered to help me restructure my pricing and client management, saying his experience with insurance claims gave him insight into how businesses should properly document their services. When I politely declined, explaining that I preferred to maintain control over my business operations, he seemed hurt but didn't push the issue. Then came the suggestions about my personal security. Marcus pointed out that my work with law enforcement and corporate investigations could potentially make me a target for retaliation. He researched home security systems and presented me with detailed proposals for cameras, motion sensors, and reinforced locks. When I agreed to basic security measures, he insisted on installing everything himself, claiming it would save money and ensure it was done correctly. I now realize he was learning the vulnerabilities of our home's security while appearing to strengthen it. The life insurance conversation happened 6 months ago, right around the time Marcus received his promotion at Cascade Insurance. He came home one evening with brochures and actuarial tables, explaining that his new position included better understanding of risk management and financial planning. "We should increase our coverage," he said, "especially given my higher income and the potential dangers associated with my work." The amounts he suggested seemed excessive, but his arguments were logical and well-researched. My work did involve potential risks, and we were both young and healthy, making the premiums relatively affordable. I signed the paperwork without reading every detail, trusting Marcus's expertise in insurance matters. The policy was for $2 million, with Marcus as the primary beneficiary and a double indemnity clause for accidental death. At the time, it seemed like responsible financial planning. Now I understood it was the foundation of his plan to eliminate me. The changes in Marcus's behavior accelerated after the insurance policy was finalized. He became more controlling about my schedule, insisting on knowing exactly where I would be and when I would return. He started monitoring our household expenses more closely, questioning purchases I made for my business or personal needs. When I traveled for work, he called multiple times each day, claiming he was worried about my safety, but asking questions that felt like surveillance. Our physical relationship began to deteriorate as well. Marcus became distant and mechanical, going through the motions of affection without any genuine warmth. When I tried to discuss the changes I was noticing, he attributed everything to stress, from his new responsibilities at work. He was handling larger cases now, he explained, with more complex fraud investigations that required longer hours and more detailed analysis. I wanted to believe him, so I convinced myself that we were going through a temporary rough patch that would resolve once he adjusted to his new role. The discovery that changed everything happened 3 weeks ago, on a Thursday evening when Marcus was supposedly working late on a complicated claim. I was in my office reviewing security footage for a client when my main computer started running slowly. Concerned about a potential malware infection, I decided to run a comprehensive system scan. But first, I wanted to check our home network to ensure no other devices were compromised. Marcus's laptop was connected to our Wi-Fi network, and as part of my security audit, I accessed the router logs to see what traffic was flowing through our system. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past 6 months, Marcus's computer had been visiting websites and forums dedicated to discussing methods of committing undetectable murders. The search terms were sophisticated and specific, showing someone who understood how to avoid leaving digital evidence. I sat frozen in my office chair, staring at the logs that detailed my husband's research into my potential death. The timestamps showed he'd been conducting these searches during his supposed late nights at work, from hotel rooms during business trips, and even from our home while I was sleeping upstairs. He'd been careful to use private browsing modes and VPN services, but he hadn't counted on his wife being an expert in digital forensics who monitored their home network for security purposes. The content of his research was methodical and chilling. He'd studied household accidents that commonly resulted in death, focusing on scenarios that would appear natural or accidental to investigators. Falls downstairs, electrical accidents, carbon monoxide poisoning, medication interactions, and food allergies were all extensively researched. He'd joined forums where people discussed true crime cases, asking seemingly innocent questions about how investigations determined whether deaths were accidental or intentional. Most terrifying were his searches related to his own profession. Marcus had been researching how insurance companies investigated claims for accidental death benefits, studying cases where payouts had been denied due to suspicious circumstances. He was using his professional knowledge to plan a murder that would pass both police investigation and insurance company scrutiny. This wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden decision. This was a calculated long-term plan to eliminate me and profit from my death. I spent the rest of that night documenting everything I found, taking screenshots and copying files to secure drives that I could hide outside our home. My forensics training had taught me that digital evidence could be altered or destroyed quickly, so I needed to preserve everything immediately. I also began monitoring his computer activity in real time, using techniques I'd developed for tracking cyber criminals. Over the following days, I watched Marcus's research intensify. He'd moved beyond general information about accidents to specific planning for my death. He researched my daily routines, noting when I worked alone in my office, when I traveled for business, and when I might be most vulnerable. He'd even created detailed floor plans of our house, marking potential staging areas and escape routes. The level of premeditation was staggering. The breakthrough came when I discovered Marcus had been communicating with someone else about his plans. Buried in encrypted messaging apps were conversations with Amber Hayes, a coworker from Cascade Insurance. Their relationship had clearly moved far beyond professional collaboration. Amber was encouraging Marcus's plans, offering suggestions about how to stage my death and discussing their future together once I was gone. She'd even helped him research which life insurance companies had the most lenient investigation policies for accidental death claims. Reading their messages felt like being stabbed repeatedly. They discussed me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a human being. Amber called me the obstacle and the complication, while Marcus referred to our marriage as the situation that needs to be resolved. They'd been planning their life together for months, discussing where they would live, how they would spend the insurance money, and when Marcus could plausibly begin dating again after my tragic death. The timeline for my murder was becoming clear from their conversations. Marcus was planning to act during his next business trip, which would provide him with an alibi while giving him access to our home when I would be alone. The trip was scheduled for the following week, supposedly to Portland for a conference on insurance fraud prevention. The irony was devastating. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I now faced an impossible decision. I could go to the police with the evidence I'd gathered, but I wasn't certain it would be enough to arrest Marcus before he could act. Digital evidence could be disputed, and without physical proof of his intentions, he might only receive a warning that would make him more careful and dangerous. Alternatively, I could confront him directly, but that would likely escalate the situation and put me in immediate danger. The solution came to me during a sleepless night spent reviewing Marcus's research for the 100th time. He'd been studying me like a case file, learning my patterns and vulnerabilities. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the very skills that made me valuable to law enforcement and corporations. I was an expert in digital surveillance, evidence preservation, and security systems. If Marcus wanted to play a game of cat and mouse, he'd chosen the wrong target. I began my own investigation, this time focusing on Marcus's activities outside our home. Using the same techniques I employed for corporate clients, I tracked his movements, his spending patterns, and his communications. I discovered he'd been lying about his whereabouts for months. The late nights at work were actually meetings with Amber at her apartment. The business trips included personal side trips that weren't reflected in his expense reports. He'd even rented a storage unit, where he was keeping equipment and supplies that could only be intended for harming me. The evidence I gathered painted a picture of a man who'd been living a double life for almost a year. Marcus had been systematically preparing to murder me while maintaining the facade of a loving husband. He'd researched my work schedule, my client meetings, and my travel plans. He'd learned the security codes for our home alarm system and disabled certain sensors without my knowledge. He'd even practiced breaking into our house during my business trips, as evidenced by subtle changes in my office that I'd initially attributed to cleaning staff or minor settling of the house. Most chilling was the discovery that Marcus had been testing methods of harming me on a small scale. Medications I took regularly had been tampered with, not enough to cause serious harm but enough to gauge my reactions and sensitivities. Food in our refrigerator showed signs of contamination that could have caused illness if consumed in larger quantities. He'd been conducting experiments on me, refining his approach for the final attack. The realization that I'd been living with a potential killer for months, sharing a bed with someone who was actively planning my death, was almost too much to process. Every kiss, every conversation, every moment of apparent normalcy had been a lie. Marcus had been studying me like a lab rat, waiting for the perfect opportunity to end my life and claim his reward. But I wasn't going to be a victim. I was going to use every skill I'd developed over years of digital forensics work to turn the tables on Marcus. He wanted to play a game of deception and manipulation. I was going to show him what a real expert could accomplish when properly motivated. The man who thought he could outsmart an insurance investigation was about to discover what happened when he targeted someone who made a living outsmarting criminals. The planning phase of my counterattack began immediately. I needed to gather enough evidence to ensure Marcus would face serious criminal charges while protecting myself from immediate harm. I also needed to control the timing of the confrontation, to minimize the risk that he would escalate to violence when cornered. Most importantly, I needed to document everything in a way that would be admissible in court and compelling to a jury. Using my access to his computer and phone, I began collecting evidence of his plans in real time. Every search he conducted, every message he sent to Amber, every website he visited was automatically backed up to secure servers that Marcus couldn't access or detect. I installed tracking software on his devices that would monitor his location and activities, even when he thought he was being careful. I was building a comprehensive case file that would destroy any attempt at denial or deflection. The final piece of my preparation involved securing my physical safety during the confrontation. I couldn't simply change the locks and hope for the best. I needed a comprehensive security plan that would protect me while allowing me to gather evidence of Marcus's reaction when he discovered his plans had been exposed. The locksmith who responded to my late-night call was confused by my urgency, but professional enough to complete the work without asking too many questions. By morning, every lock in our house had been changed, and Marcus's keys would be useless. As I waited for his return from the supposed business trip, that was actually a final planning session with Amber, I felt a strange combination of fear and anticipation. In a few hours, the man I'd once loved would discover that his intended victim had become his worst nightmare. The insurance adjuster who thought he could stage the perfect accident was about to learn that he'd made the fatal error of targeting someone who specialized in uncovering hidden evidence and exposing lies. The sound of his car in our driveway at 2:47 a.m. meant the final phase of this deadly game was about to begin. Through the window, I watched Marcus approach our front door with confidence, probably already visualizing how he would implement his plan over the coming days. The sound of his key failing to turn in the lock was the first crack in his carefully constructed facade. When he realized the locks had been changed, he would know that everything had changed, and I would be ready for whatever came next. The pounding on the front door started 30 seconds after Marcus realized his keys no longer worked. 3 sharp knocks, then silence, then 5 more knocks in rapid succession. I remained motionless in my living room, laptop closed, all lights off except for the pale glow from the street lamp filtering through the curtains. Through the peephole, I could see Marcus standing on our porch, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and what looked like calculation. He pulled out his phone, and mine immediately buzzed with an incoming call. I let it go to voicemail. Marcus walked around to the back of the house, testing the sliding door that led to our deck. I'd changed those locks too, along with every other entry point he might try. The security system I'd upgraded 3 days earlier would alert me to any attempt at forced entry, and the cameras I'd installed would record everything. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my own safety. Marcus returned to the front door and began knocking again, this time calling. My name? Claire, I know you're in there. Your car is in the driveway and I can see the glow from your computer. What's going on? Why did you change the locks? His voice carried the practiced calm of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations, but I could hear the underlying tension. He wasn't expecting this, and Marcus didn't handle surprises well. I opened the front door, but left the chain engaged, creating a 3-inch gap that allowed us to see each other, but prevented him from entering. Marcus looked exactly like he always did after his business trips, slightly rumpled from travel but otherwise normal. If I hadn't seen the evidence of his plans with my own eyes, I might have believed his confused expression was genuine. I know what you've been planning, Marcus, I said quietly. I know about the searches, the research, the messages with Amber. I know about the storage unit and the insurance policy and everything else. His face went completely blank for a moment, that dead expression I'd learned to recognize when he was processing unexpected information. Then he smiled, the same charming smile that had first attracted me at that technology conference years ago. Claire, honey, I think you're confused. I just got back from Portland and I'm exhausted. Can we please talk about this inside? Whatever's bothering you, we can work it out. No, Marcus. We can't work this out. Not when you've been planning to kill me for the past 6 months. The smile faltered. Marcus stepped closer to the door, pressing his face near the gap. That's a very serious accusation, Claire. You're obviously upset about something, but murder? That's completely insane. I think you need to see someone. Maybe talk to Dr. Marsh about adjusting your anxiety medication. The gaslighting was immediate and predictable. Marcus had always been skilled at making me question my own perceptions when we disagreed about something. But this time, I had documentation that couldn't be disputed or explained away. I have copies of everything, Marcus. Your search history, your messages with Amber, your research into staging household accidents. I know you weren't in Portland for work. I know you were with her, planning the final details. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a hardness creeping into his eyes that I'd never seen before. You've been spying on me? Going through my personal communications? That's a violation of privacy, Claire. It's probably illegal. What's illegal is conspiracy to commit murder. What's illegal is insurance fraud. What's illegal is everything you've been planning for months. I kept my voice steady, drawing on the same professional composure I used when testifying in court cases. I've documented everything, Marcus. Every search, every message, every lie you've told. It's all backed up in multiple locations where you can't access or delete it. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying my face through the gap in the door. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely. The pretense of confusion was gone, replaced by a cold calculation that made my skin crawl. How long have you known? Long enough to protect myself and gather evidence. Long enough to realize that the man I married never actually existed. You always were too smart for your own good, Marcus said softly. I told Amber that your work made you dangerous, but she thought I was being paranoid. Turns out I was right to be concerned. The casual way he mentioned Amber, the matter-of-fact tone he used to discuss my intelligence as a liability, confirmed everything I'd discovered. This wasn't the Marcus I thought I knew having a breakdown or making desperate decisions. This was someone who had been deceiving me from the beginning. Someone capable of planning my death with the same methodical approach he brought to insurance investigations. The business trips, the late nights, the life insurance policy, all of it was part of your plan, I said. It wasn't a question anymore. Marcus shrugged, as if we were discussing something mundane like grocery shopping. The opportunity presented itself. Your income increased, making the insurance policy more valuable. Your work sometimes put you in dangerous situations, which would make an accident more believable. Amber and I realized we could build a life together if we handled the situation correctly. The situation. You mean murdering your wife? I mean resolving a problem that was preventing both of us from being happy. You were never going to give me a divorce, Claire. You loved the idea of being married too much. This way, everyone gets what they want. The complete lack of remorse in his voice was more terrifying than any display of anger would have been. Marcus had rationalized my murder as a business decision, weighing costs and benefits like he would any insurance claim. I was an obstacle to be removed, not a person whose life had value. What happens now, Marcus? Your plan is ruined. I'm alive, I have evidence, and you can't get into this house. Now we negotiate. You give me the evidence you've collected, sign a separation agreement that's favorable to both of us, and we go our separate ways. No police, no criminal charges, no messy public scandal that would hurt both our careers. And if I refuse? Marcus's smile returned, but it was different now, predatory in a way that made me step back from the door. Then you force me to consider alternative approaches. You can't stay locked in that house forever, Claire. You have to work, travel, Live your life. And I know your routines better than anyone. The threat was clear, even though he'd been careful not to state it explicitly. If I didn't cooperate with his new plan, he would find another way to eliminate me. The only difference would be that now he knew I was aware of his intentions, which would make him more dangerous and unpredictable. I need time to think about your proposal, I said, already knowing I would never agree to it but needing to end this conversation before Marcus escalated to physical violence. Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be staying at the Hampton Inn on Industrial Boulevard while you consider your options. Room 237, if you need to reach me. He pulled out his phone and showed me the screen, displaying his hotel reservation. I'll wait for your call, but not indefinitely. These kinds of situations have a way of becoming more complicated the longer they're allowed to continue. Marcus turned and walked back to his car without another word, leaving me standing in my doorway with my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I watched him drive away before closing and triple-locking the door, then immediately began implementing the security protocols I'd prepared for this moment. The first call went to Detective Brian Kelly at the Riverside Police Department. Brian and I had worked together on several digital forensics cases, and I knew he would take my concerns seriously, even though the evidence was primarily digital. Brian, it's Claire Davidson. I need to report a credible threat against my life from my husband. I have extensive digital evidence of his plans to kill me for insurance money. Jesus, Claire, are you safe right now? Do you need immediate protection? I'm secure in my house for now, but I need to get this evidence to you as soon as possible. Can you meet me at the station tonight? I'll be there in 20 minutes. Bring everything you have. The second call went to my business partner, Natalie Wong, who lived across town but kept irregular hours due to the nature of our work. Nat, I need you to activate our emergency backup protocols immediately. I'm dealing with a serious personal security threat, and I need all our client data and business systems secured. Done. Do you need me to come over? No. Stay where you are and monitor our systems remotely. If anything happens to me, contact Detective Kelly at RPD and give him access to everything we've backed up. The third call was to my lawyer, David Chen, whose answering service connected me to his emergency line. David specialized in criminal defense and had helped several of my clients navigate legal issues related to their digital forensics cases. David, I need immediate legal representation for a domestic threat situation. My husband has been planning to kill me, and I have digital evidence to prove it. I'll meet you at the police station. Don't say anything to anyone until I get there. Loading my evidence onto encrypted drives took another 30 minutes. I'd prepared for this moment by organizing everything into clear categories that would be easy for law enforcement to understand. Marcus's search history was compiled chronologically, showing the progression from general research to specific planning. His communications with Amber were organized by topic, highlighting their discussions of my murder and their future plans. Financial records showed the insurance policy and his attempts to hide assets. Location data from his phone proved he'd been lying about his whereabouts for months. The drive to the police station took 15 minutes through empty streets. Riverside was a quiet city where most residents were asleep by midnight, making my journey feel surreal and isolated. I kept checking my mirrors for Marcus's Honda, but the roads remained empty. At the station, Detective Kelly was waiting with David Chen and a digital forensics specialist from the state police who could verify the authenticity of my evidence. Presenting the case took over 3 hours. Every piece of digital evidence had to be explained, verified, and documented according to legal standards. The detective asked detailed questions about my relationship with Marcus, the timeline of his planning, and the specific threats he'd made. David advised me throughout the process, ensuring I didn't inadvertently compromise my legal position while cooperating fully with the investigation. This is one of the most thorough evidence packages I've ever seen for a domestic threat case, Detective Kelly said as we finished reviewing the final files. Your husband clearly underestimated your professional capabilities. The digital trail he left is comprehensive enough to support multiple felony charges. What happens next? I asked. We'll obtain warrants for his arrest and for searches of his storage unit, his workplace computer, and his hotel room. We'll also coordinate with Portland police to verify his alibi for the supposed business trip. If everything checks out the way I expect it will, Marcus will be in custody by morning. And Amber Hayes? She'll be arrested as a co-conspirator. Her involvement in planning your murder makes her equally culpable under Oregon law. David leaned forward in his chair. What about Claire's immediate safety? If Marcus realizes she's gone to the police, he might escalate to immediate violence. We'll have units monitoring her house and the hotel where Marcus is staying. If he makes any move toward Claire or tries to leave town, we'll arrest him. Immediately. The sun was rising over Riverside as I finally returned home, escorted by 2 police officers who checked every room and confirmed the security system was functioning properly. I was exhausted but too wired to sleep, so I made coffee and sat in my kitchen watching the morning news. The normalcy of the weather report and traffic updates felt absurd after spending the night documenting my husband's plan to murder me. My phone rang at 8:30 a.m. The caller ID showed Marcus's number, but when I answered, I heard Amber's voice instead. Claire? This is Amber Hayes. I think we need to talk. I have nothing to say to you, Amber. You and Marcus can discuss your legal defense with your attorneys. You don't understand the situation you've created, Amber said, her voice tense, with barely controlled anger. Marcus is a good man who's been trapped in an unhappy marriage. He never wanted to hurt you. He just wanted to be free to build a life with someone who actually appreciated him. He wanted to kill me for insurance. Money so he could start over with you. There's nothing noble or romantic about murder, Amber. That's not what this was about. You made it impossible for him to leave you any other way. You would have destroyed him financially in a divorce, taken everything he'd worked for. He was protecting himself. The complete disconnect from reality in Amber's voice was stunning. She genuinely seemed to believe that planning my murder was a reasonable response to marital problems. Amber, you're going to be arrested for conspiracy to commit murder. I'd suggest you spend your time finding a good lawyer instead of calling me. You think you're so smart with all your computer skills and your important clients, but you never understood what Marcus needed from a relationship. You were too busy with your career to be a real wife to him. A real wife who deserved to be murdered for life insurance money? A real wife who would have recognized when her husband was unhappy and done something about it instead of forcing him to look elsewhere for affection and understanding. The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. Amber apparently saw herself as the victim in this situation, the other woman who'd been forced to help plan a murder because I hadn't been a good enough wife to prevent my husband from straying. The psychology of it was fascinating in a horrifying way. Detective Kelly called an hour later with an update. We arrested Marcus at his hotel room 20 minutes ago. He didn't resist, but he also didn't seem surprised. He asked for a lawyer immediately and hasn't said anything else. We found detailed floor plans of your house in his hotel room, along with what appears to be a timeline for implementing his plan. What about Amber? Arrested at her apartment. She was more vocal than Marcus, claiming this was all a misunderstanding, and that you'd misinterpreted innocent conversations. She also had materials related to your murder in her possession, including research on life insurance payouts and accidental death investigations. So it's over? The immediate threat is over. Both suspects are in custody, and we've secured all the physical evidence. But the legal process is just beginning. Are you prepared for what comes next? I knew what Detective Kelly meant. A criminal. Trial would require me to testify about the most intimate details of my marriage, to have my relationship with Marcus dissected in public. The defense would try to paint me as a paranoid wife who'd misunderstood innocent behavior. The media would probably pick up the story, turning my private nightmare into public entertainment. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to make sure. They're held accountable for what they plan to do. Good. Because your evidence is strong enough that I expect both of them will be offered plea deals to avoid trial. You'll need to decide whether you're willing to accept those deals or if you want to pursue maximum penalties through a jury trial. The decision about plea deals could wait. For now, it was enough to know that Marcus and Amber were in custody, that the immediate threat to my life was over, and that I'd successfully used my professional skills to protect myself and expose their plan. I'd gone from being a potential victim to being the key witness in a criminal prosecution, and that transformation felt empowering, even as it was exhausting. I spent the rest of the morning fielding calls from friends and family who'd been contacted by police as part of the investigation. Marcus's mother, Helen, was particularly difficult to deal with, insisting that I must have misunderstood her son's intentions, and that any problems in our marriage were equally my fault. Tommy, Marcus's brother, was more supportive, but clearly struggling to reconcile the man he'd known with the evidence of what Marcus had been planning. "I keep thinking there has to be some explanation," Tommy said during our phone conversation. "Marcus always seemed like such a straight arrow guy. He was protective of you, always talking about making sure you were safe when you traveled for work. He was protective because he was studying my vulnerabilities so he could exploit them later. Everything he did that seemed caring was actually research for planning my murder." That's just so hard to believe. I mean, I know the evidence is there, but it's like finding out someone you've known your whole life is actually a stranger. Tommy's struggle to accept the truth about his brother reminded me of my own difficulty processing Marcus's betrayal. The man I'd married, the man I'd shared a bed with for 7 years, had been systematically planning my death while maintaining a facade of normalcy. How do you reconcile love and trust with such calculated deception? How do you move forward knowing that your judgment about someone so important was so completely wrong? The answer, I was beginning to realize, was that you don't move forward by trying to make sense of the senseless. You move forward by acknowledging that some people are capable of extraordinary deception, that evil can wear familiar faces, and that survival sometimes requires abandoning everything you thought you knew about someone you loved. By afternoon, the story had leaked to local media, despite police efforts to maintain confidentiality. The Riverside Daily ran a front-page story with the headline, "Local Woman Foils Husband's Murder Plot, Using Computer Skills." The article was generally accurate but focused more on the dramatic elements than the months of systematic planning that had led to Marcus's arrest. I declined interview requests, referring all media inquiries to David Chen. Natalie arrived at my house that evening with takeout food and a bottle of wine, insisting that I shouldn't be alone after everything that had happened. We sat in my kitchen reviewing the security footage from the previous night, watching Marcus test different entry points and become increasingly frustrated when he realized he couldn't get inside. "Look at his face when he figures out you've changed all the locks," Natalie said, pointing to the timestamp showing 2:52 a.m. "That's the moment he realizes you know everything and his plan is completely ruined. I've watched this section about 50 times today. It's the moment I stopped being his victim and became his worst nightmare. You know what I find most chilling? How normal he looks throughout all of this. If you didn't know what he'd been planning, you'd think he was just a confused husband trying to figure out why his wife had locked him out. That's what made him so dangerous. He could maintain that facade of normalcy while planning something monstrous. If I hadn't discovered his digital trail, he would have killed me, and everyone would have believed it was a tragic accident." Natalie poured more wine and studied the security footage again. "What happens to your house now? Can you stay here? After everything that's happened?" I'd been wondering the same thing. The house held 7 years of memories, most of which were now contaminated by the knowledge of what Marcus had been planning. Every room contained evidence of his deception, from the security system he'd manipulated to the kitchen where he'd tested ways to poison me. Could I ever feel safe here again, knowing how thoroughly he'd studied every vulnerable point? I don't know yet. Maybe I'll sell it and start over somewhere new. Maybe I'll renovate it completely, change everything so it doesn't remind me of him. Right now, I just need to focus on getting through the legal process. Whatever you decide, you know I'll help. And Claire? What you did was incredible. You took a terrifying situation and turned it around completely. You used your skills to protect yourself and expose the truth. That takes courage most people don't have. As Natalie left that night and I prepared for bed in my newly secured house, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 48 hours. 2 days ago, I'd been a woman married to a man who was secretly planning her murder. Tonight, I was a survivor who'd successfully exposed a conspiracy and protected herself from harm. The transformation felt surreal, but it also felt empowering in a way I hadn't expected. I'd learned that I was stronger and more resourceful than I'd ever imagined. When faced with the ultimate betrayal and the ultimate threat, I'd responded not with panic or helplessness, but with strategic thinking and decisive action. I'd used my professional expertise to save my own life and ensure justice for the people who'd planned to destroy me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the legal process continued and the media attention intensified. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt truly safe in my own home. The locks had been changed, the security system upgraded, and the people who'd threatened me were in custody. I'd reclaimed control of my life and my safety, and that felt like the beginning of something new rather than just the end of something terrible. The arraignment hearing took place 3 days later in the Riverside County Courthouse, a limestone building that had served the community for over 60 years. I sat in the gallery with David Chen, watching as Marcus and Amber were brought in, wearing orange jumpsuits and restraints. It was jarring to see Marcus in that setting, stripped of the professional polish that had been such a fundamental part of his identity. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the institutional clothing and the weight of the charges against him. Judge Patricia Woodward read the charges aloud in a voice that carried through the silent courtroom. Conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, insurance fraud, attempted murder. The words hung in the air like a sentencing pronouncement, each charge representing months of planning and deception that had nearly cost me my life. Marcus's attorney, a well-dressed woman named Catherine Mills, entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf. Amber's public defender did the same. The prosecution requested that both defendants be held without bail, arguing that they posed a flight risk and a continued danger to me. Marcus's attorney countered that her client was a respected member of the community with no prior criminal record who deserved reasonable bail terms. The judge listened to both arguments before denying bail entirely, citing the premeditated nature of the alleged crimes and the extensive planning documented in the evidence. As the defendants were led away, Marcus turned and looked directly at me for the first time since his arrest. The expression on his face wasn't anger or remorse, but something closer to disappointment, as if I'd failed to live up to his expectations by surviving his murder plot. The coldness in his eyes confirmed what I'd begun to understand over the past few days. The man I'd married had never actually existed. What I'd taken for love had been performance, and what I'd interpreted as devotion had been surveillance. District Attorney Robert Chen, David's cousin and the prosecutor handling the case, met with us after the hearing to discuss strategy. The evidence was overwhelming, he explained, but the defense would likely argue that Marcus's online research was academic rather than criminal, that his relationship with Amber was emotional rather than conspiratorial, and that I had misinterpreted innocent behavior through the lens of marital paranoia. They'll try to paint you as a jealous wife who discovered her husband's affair and created an elaborate fantasy about murder to destroy him in revenge, Robert warned. Catherine Mills is experienced with high-profile criminal defense, and she's particularly skilled at attacking the credibility of digital evidence. The evidence speaks for itself, I replied. Marcus researched specific methods of killing me, communicated with Amber about implementing those methods, and took concrete steps toward carrying out his plan. There's nothing ambiguous about his intentions. I agree, but we need to be prepared. for every possible defense strategy. They might argue that your work in digital forensics gave you the technical ability to fabricate evidence or manipulate data. They might claim that your access to his devices violated his privacy rights, making the evidence inadmissible. David leaned forward across the conference table. What about plea negotiations? Are they likely to consider deals that would avoid trial? It's possible, but given the severity of the charges and the extensive media coverage, both defendants might prefer to take their chances with a jury. Amber's attorney has already indicated she plans to claim she was manipulated by Marcus and didn't understand the seriousness of their discussions. The mention of media coverage reminded me how public my private nightmare had become. The local story had been picked up by regional news outlets and true crime podcasts, turning my marriage and near murder into entertainment for strangers. Online forums debated whether I'd overreacted to my husband's suspicious behavior or heroically saved my own life. The comment sections were filled with armchair detectives analyzing every detail of the case and offering opinions about my relationship with Marcus. Some commenters praised my intelligence and resourcefulness in exposing the plot. Others suggested I'd invaded my husband's privacy and destroyed his life over innocent online searches. A few even theorized that I'd fabricated the entire conspiracy as revenge for his affair with Amber. Reading these discussions was like watching people dissect my soul in public, reducing the most traumatic experience of my life to debate topics for strangers. The impact on my business was immediate and complicated. Some potential clients were impressed by my digital forensics skills and wanted to hire me specifically because of the publicity. Others worried that my personal drama would overshadow their cases, or that I might be too emotionally compromised to handle their investigations objectively. I found myself spending almost as much time managing media inquiries and public perception as I did working on actual cases. Natalie handled most of the business operations while I focused on the legal proceedings and tried to process the emotional aftermath of discovering my husband's plans. She screened potential clients, managed existing contracts, and dealt with the constant stream of interview requests from reporters and podcasters. Without her support, I would have been completely overwhelmed by the attention. The psychological impact of learning that someone I'd loved and trusted had been planning my death was more complex than I'd anticipated. I experienced anger, certainly, but also grief for the relationship I'd thought we had, and confusion about my own judgment. How had I lived with someone for 7 years without recognizing his capacity for violence? What signs had I missed or dismissed? Could I ever trust my instincts about people again? Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist David had recommended, helped me understand that questioning my own judgment was a normal response to such profound betrayal. Predators often deliberately target empathetic, trusting people because those qualities make their victims more vulnerable to manipulation. Marcus had likely chosen me specifically because my compassionate nature would make me excuse his gradually escalating controlling behavior. People who plan violence against intimate partners are often extremely skilled at maintaining facades, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our sessions. They study their victims intensively, learning exactly how to present themselves in ways that will generate trust and affection. You weren't naive or foolish for believing the person Marcus pretended to be. You were responding normally to someone who was deliberately deceiving you. The therapy sessions helped me understand that my survival hadn't been lucky accident, but the result of specific skills and instincts that had served me well. My training in digital forensics had made me sensitive to inconsistencies and suspicious of unexplained changes in behavior. My professional experience with criminal investigations had taught me to document evidence carefully and think strategically about personal safety. Without realizing it, I'd been unconsciously applying my work skills to my personal life, which had ultimately saved me. 2 weeks after the arraignment, Detective Kelly called with disturbing news. While searching Marcus's storage unit, investigators had discovered detailed surveillance photos of me taken over several months. The images showed me leaving my house, arriving at client meetings, working alone in my office, and traveling to various locations around Riverside. Some were taken from such close range that Marcus must have been following me for hours without my awareness. He documented your entire routine, Detective Kelly explained when I came to the station to review the evidence. Work schedule, travel patterns, when you were home alone, when you met with clients. He even photographed the inside of your house during times when you were away, showing he'd been entering your home without your knowledge. The photos were methodical and clinical, like evidence files from a criminal investigation. Marcus had been studying me with the same attention to detail he brought to insurance fraud cases, cataloging every aspect of my life that could be relevant to planning my death. Some images were date-stamped from as early as 8 months ago, meaning his surveillance had begun long before I'd noticed any changes in his behavior. Most disturbing were photos taken inside our house while I was traveling for business. Marcus had documented the layout of rooms, the location of security cameras I'd installed, and even the contents of my office files. He'd been searching through my personal papers, probably looking for information about my client contracts and financial assets. The violation felt almost as profound as the murder plot itself. We also found receipts and purchases that corroborate his planning, Detective Kelly continued. Tools that could be used to stage accidents, chemicals that could cause poisoning, and equipment for bypassing home security systems. He wasn't just researching methods online, he was acquiring the materials to implement them. The evidence painted a picture of preparation that went far beyond idle speculation or fantasy. Marcus had been moving methodically toward actually murdering me, gathering both intelligence and supplies for the task. If I hadn't discovered his digital trail when I did, he would have been ready to act within weeks. Amber's role in the conspiracy became clearer as investigators analyzed her communications and searched her apartment. She hadn't been a passive participant seduced by Marcus's manipulation, but an active collaborator who'd contributed ideas and encouragement. Text messages showed her researching life insurance policies and discussing how long Marcus should wait after my death before they could begin their relationship publicly. She was planning their wedding while helping plan your murder, Detective Kelly said grimly. We found venue brochures and wedding planning materials in her apartment, all dated for approximately 1 year after your projected death date. They'd calculated how long the grief period should last for appearances. The revelation that Amber had been planning her wedding to my husband while helping him plot my murder was somehow more personally devastating than the murder conspiracy itself. It demonstrated such callous disregard for my humanity that I struggled to process it emotionally. I wasn't just an obstacle to be removed, but a non-entity whose death was simply a logistical step in their romantic timeline. Catherine Mills, Marcus's attorney, requested a meeting to discuss possible plea arrangements. She suggested that Marcus might be willing to plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for a sentence that would allow him to be eligible for parole in 10 to 15 years. The proposal felt like another insult. The suggestion that attempting to murder your spouse for insurance money deserved less punishment than other violent crimes. He's willing to admit to planning your death but wants credit for not actually going through with it, David explained after reviewing the proposed plea deal. Mills is arguing that since you discovered the plot before he acted, this should be treated as conspiracy rather than attempted murder. He didn't abandon the plan because he developed a conscience. He was forced to stop because I caught him. That's not rehabilitation. It's prevention. I agree completely. Robert Chen has already indicated the prosecution won't accept any deal. That doesn't include significant prison time. The evidence is too strong and the charges too serious for Marcus to escape meaningful consequences. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the arraignment, giving both sides time to prepare their arguments and review evidence. During that period, I tried to establish some normalcy in my daily routine while dealing with the ongoing investigation and media attention. I returned to work on a limited basis, taking only cases that could be handled primarily from my home office. The house felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge of what Marcus had planned to do there. Every room held memories of our life together, but those memories were now filtered through the understanding that he'd been studying the space as a potential crime scene. The kitchen where we'd shared countless meals was also where he'd researched ways to poison me. The bedroom where we'd slept together was also where he'd planned my death while lying next to me. I hired a contractor to renovate the master bedroom completely, changing the layout and replacing everything from the flooring to the light fixtures. I wanted to eliminate any physical reminders of the man who'd shared that space while plotting my murder. The renovation was expensive and probably unnecessary from a practical standpoint, but it felt essential for my psychological recovery. Mrs. Patricia Lane, our elderly neighbor who'd always been friendly but not intrusive, stopped by one afternoon, while the contractors were working. She brought homemade cookies and an unexpected revelation about Marcus's behavior during the months before his arrest. I probably should have said something earlier, but I didn't want to seem like I was prying into your marriage, she said, as we sat on my front porch watching the workers carry debris from my bedroom renovation. But Marcus had been acting strangely for months. I'd see him leaving the house at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night. And there were times when you were away that I'd notice lights in your house moving around like someone was inside. You saw Marcus in the house when I was traveling? Well, I assumed it was Marcus, but now I wonder if I should have been more concerned. It was always late at night or very early in the morning, and he seemed to be avoiding the main lights, just using a flashlight or phone light. At the time, I figured maybe he was checking on something or doing maintenance work, but looking back, it seemed suspicious. Mrs. Lane's observations confirmed what the surveillance photos had already revealed. Marcus had been regularly entering our house during my business trips, studying the space and probably testing methods of breaking in undetected. Her willingness to share these observations now, despite her reluctance to interfere at the time, illustrated how even well-meaning neighbors often hesitate to report suspicious behavior that might involve domestic situations. Did you notice anything else unusual about his behavior? He'd been asking odd questions about your schedule. Nothing that seemed inappropriate at the time, just casual inquiries about when you traveled or worked late. But he seemed very interested in the specifics of your routine more than a neighbor would normally care about. The revelation that Marcus had been gathering intelligence about my schedule from neighbors as well as through direct surveillance added another layer to the conspiracy. He'd been using his charm and apparent concern for my welfare to extract information that would help him plan my murder. Every interaction, every casual conversation had been part of his preparation for killing me. Tommy, Marcus's brother, visited me one evening as the preliminary hearing approached. He looked haggard and older than his 32 years, clearly struggling with the revelations about his brother's true nature. We sat in my renovated living room, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of how someone we'd both thought we knew could have been capable of such calculated evil. I keep going through my memories, looking for signs I missed, Tommy said, staring into his coffee cup. There were things that seem obvious now but didn't register at the time. The way he talked about your work sometimes, like he resented your success. How he'd ask detailed questions about your clients and travel schedule. I thought he was being protective, but maybe he was gathering information. You couldn't have known what he was planning, Tommy. I lived with him every day and didn't realize what he was doing until I found the digital evidence. But I'm his brother. Shouldn't I have recognized that he was capable of something like this? What does it say about my judgment that I completely misjudged someone I've known my whole life? Tommy's struggle mirrored my own questions about judgment and trust. How do you maintain faith in your ability to assess people's character when someone so close to you proves capable of such deception? How do you continue forming relationships when you've learned that the most intimate connection in your life was built on lies? Maybe the lesson isn't that we're bad judges of character, I suggested. Maybe it's that some people are extraordinarily good at hiding their true nature. Marcus fooled everyone who knew him, including his own family. That suggests skill on his part rather than failure on ours. I just keep thinking about how excited he was when you two got married. He seemed genuinely happy, genuinely in love. Was all of that fake? I don't know, and I'm not sure it matters anymore. What I know is that whatever feelings he might have had initially, they weren't strong enough to prevent him from planning my murder when I became inconvenient. Tommy nodded sadly, finishing his coffee and preparing to leave. I want you to know that Mom and I will testify for the prosecution if needed. We won't protect Marcus from the consequences of what he's done, even though he's family. The promise of support from Marcus's family felt significant, though I wasn't sure it would be necessary for the prosecution's case. The digital evidence was comprehensive enough to prove guilt without character testimony. But knowing that his own mother and brother recognized the severity of his crimes and were willing to speak against him felt like a form of validation. As the preliminary hearing approached, I found myself both dreading and anticipating the legal proceedings. The hearing would be my first opportunity to see all the evidence presented in court and to gauge how strong the prosecution's case actually was. It would also be the first time I'd have to face Marcus in a formal legal setting, discussing the details of his plan to kill me in front of strangers. Dr. Martinez helped me prepare for the emotional challenges of testifying by practicing techniques for staying calm and focused under cross-examination. Catherine Mills would likely try to rattle me, to make me appear unstable or vindictive in front of the judge. I needed to remain composed and factual, letting the evidence speak for itself, rather than allowing emotions to undermine my credibility. Remember that your survival and the evidence you gathered speak to your competence and strength. Dr. Martinez reminded me during our final session before the hearing. You're not a victim who got lucky. You're a professional who used your skills to protect yourself and expose a serious crime. That's the narrative you want to project in court. The night before the preliminary hearing, I received an unexpected phone call from Vanessa Torres, a true crime journalist who'd been following the case. She wanted to interview me for a book she was writing about women who'd survived intimate partner violence through their own resourcefulness and intelligence. What interests me about your case isn't just that you discovered your husband's plan to kill you, Vanessa explained. It's that you used your professional expertise to gather evidence and protect yourself in a way that ensured justice would be served. You turned your technical skills into weapons for survival. I'm not sure I'm ready to talk publicly about the details yet. The legal process is still ongoing. I understand, and I'd be willing to wait until after the trial to conduct formal interviews. But I wanted you to know that your story could help other women recognize warning signs and understand that they have more power to protect themselves than they might realize. The idea that my experience could help other women was appealing, but I wasn't ready to commit to sharing the most intimate details of my marriage and near murder with the public. For now, my focus needed to remain on the legal proceedings and my own psychological recovery. Perhaps later, when the criminal case was resolved and I'd had more time to process everything, I might be ready to use my story to help others. As I prepared for bed the night before the preliminary hearing, I reflected on how much my life had changed in just a few weeks. I'd gone from being a woman trapped in a marriage with a man planning her death to being a survivor taking control of her own narrative. The transformation felt empowering, but also surreal, as if I was watching someone else's life unfold rather than living my own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the legal system began evaluating the evidence of Marcus's crimes, but tonight, I felt prepared and determined to see justice served for what he'd planned to do to me. The woman who'd once trusted blindly had learned to verify everything. The wife who'd made excuses for suspicious behavior had become an expert at recognizing deception. And the potential victim had transformed into the key witness in her own attempted murder case. The preliminary hearing unfolded in Judge Woodward's courtroom with clinical precision. each piece of evidence methodically presented and documented for the record. I sat in the witness gallery watching Robert Chen lay out the prosecution's case with devastating clarity. The digital forensics timeline showed Marcus's escalating research into methods of killing me, progressing from general searches about household accidents to specific inquiries about untraceable poisons and staging techniques. Catherine Mills cross-examined Detective Kelly aggressively, challenging the authenticity of the digital evidence and suggesting that Marcus's online activity could have been misinterpreted or manipulated. She painted him as a devoted husband, whose professional curiosity about accident investigation had been twisted into something sinister by a wife who'd discovered his affair and wanted revenge. Detective Kelly, isn't it true that Mr. Davidson's work as an insurance adjuster required him to research various types of accidents and their causes? Mills asked, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to courtroom combat. His work involved investigating accidents after they occurred, not researching how to cause them, Detective Kelly replied firmly. The search, terms and websites Mr. Davidson visited were focused on perpetrating accidents, not investigating them. But how can you definitively distinguish between research for professional purposes and research for criminal purposes based solely on search terms? By the context and progression of the searches, the specific focus on the victim's routines and vulnerabilities, and the communications with Ms. Hayes discussing implementation of the researched methods. Mills attempted to undermine the digital evidence by suggesting I'd used my technical expertise to fabricate or manipulate data, but Robert Chen had anticipated this strategy. The state's digital forensics expert testified about the authentication protocols used to verify the evidence, explaining how timestamps, metadata, and cross-platform corroboration made falsification virtually impossible. When Amber's attorney, a overwhelmed-looking public defender named James Wright, cross-examined witnesses, he focused on portraying his client as a naive woman manipulated by Marcus rather than an active conspirator. This strategy backfired when Robert Chen presented text messages showing Amber contributing specific ideas about timing, methods, and alibis for my murder. Ms. Hayes wasn't a passive recipient of Mr. Davidson's plans, Robert Chen argued during his closing statement. She was an active participant who helped refine and improve those plans. Her messages show enthusiasm for the conspiracy and detailed knowledge of the intended crime. Judge Woodward ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial on all charges against both defendants. The decision felt like a victory, though I knew the real battle lay ahead. A preliminary hearing only required probable cause, while a trial would demand proof beyond reasonable doubt. Catherine Mills was skilled enough to create uncertainty in jurors' minds, especially about the interpretation of digital evidence. After the hearing, Robert Chen briefed me on what to expect during the trial preparation process. Mills will try to put your marriage on trial instead of Marcus's crimes. She'll argue that you invaded his privacy, that your work made you paranoid and suspicious, and that you've blown innocent behavior out of proportion because you discovered his relationship with Amber. How do we counter that narrative? By focusing on the evidence rather than emotions. The digital trail speaks for itself. Marcus researched specific methods of killing you, acquired materials consistent with those methods, and communicated with Amber about implementing the plan. Those are facts that can't be explained away by marital problems or professional paranoia. David Chen had been working with media relations experts to manage the public narrative surrounding the case. The story had gained national attention, with true crime podcasts and cable news shows analyzing every detail of Marcus's plot and my discovery of it. The coverage was generally sympathetic to me, but it also attracted unwanted attention from conspiracy theorists who questioned whether the evidence was authentic. We need to be careful about how much you engage with media requests, David advised during a strategy meeting in his downtown office. Too much publicity could make it harder to seat an impartial jury. But complete silence might allow the defense to control the narrative unchallenged. The decision was made to limit my media appearances to one carefully planned interview with a respected journalist after the trial concluded, regardless of the outcome. Until then, I would avoid discussing the case publicly and refer all inquiries to David's office. The impact on my business had stabilized somewhat, though in unexpected ways. The publicity had attracted clients who specifically wanted to work with someone who demonstrated such impressive digital forensic skills under extreme personal pressure. But it had also created complications with existing clients who worried that media attention might compromise the confidentiality of their cases. Natalie had taken over most client interactions while I focused on trial preparation, but she was reaching the limits of what she could handle alone. We needed to hire additional staff, but I was reluctant to expand the business while the criminal case remained unresolved. The uncertainty about my own future made it difficult to make long-term business decisions. The psychological preparation for trial was more complex than I'd anticipated. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that testifying about Marcus's plan to kill me would require me to relive the trauma in front of strangers, including the man who'd caused it. I would need to describe intimate details of our marriage, explain how I'd discovered his deception, and maintain my composure while Marcus sat just feet away. The defense will try to make you appear emotional or unstable on the witness stand, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our sessions. They want jurors to see you as a vindictive ex-wife rather than a crime victim. You'll need to project competence and credibility rather than vulnerability. How do I do that when I'm discussing the most traumatic experience of my life? By remembering that your survival and the evidence you gathered demonstrate your strength and intelligence. You're not a victim who got lucky. You're a professional who recognized danger and responded appropriately. Tommy Davidson called me unexpectedly one evening, his voice strained with emotion I'd rarely heard from him. Helen Davidson, Marcus's mother, had been struggling with the revelations about her son's crimes and had asked Tommy to reach out to me. "Mom wants to apologize to you," Tommy said. "She's been blaming herself, wondering if she missed signs that Marcus was capable of violence. She also feels terrible about some of the things she said right after his arrest, when she was still hoping this was all a misunderstanding." "She doesn't need to apologize to me, Tommy. None of this is her fault." "I know, but she's having a hard time accepting that the son she raised could plan something so terrible. She keeps asking what she did wrong, how she failed as a mother, to produce someone capable of attempted murder." The conversation reminded me that Marcus's crimes had created multiple victims beyond just me. His family was struggling to reconcile their memories of him with the evidence of what he'd planned to do. Helen had lost not just her son, but her understanding of who her son actually was. Would it help if I talked to her? I don't want her blaming herself for Marcus's choices. "I think it would mean a lot to her. She's been afraid to contact you, directly because she doesn't want to make things harder for you." The meeting with Helen took place at a quiet coffee shop downtown, away from the media attention that still surrounded my house and workplace. She looked fragile and older than her 68 years, wearing the exhausted expression of someone who'd been crying frequently. We sat in a corner booth where we could speak privately without being overheard. "I keep thinking about the signs I missed," Helen said, clutching her coffee cup with shaking hands. "Marcus was always such a careful, methodical child. He planned everything in detail, whether it was school projects or summer activities. I thought those were positive qualities." "They are positive qualities in most contexts. The problem wasn't Marcus being methodical. The problem was him choosing to apply those skills to planning my murder. But there must have been warning signs that he was developing violent tendencies. Children don't just become killers overnight." I'd been wondering the same thing myself, researching the psychology of intimate partner violence and trying to understand how someone develops the capacity to plan their spouse's death. The experts I'd consulted suggested that domestic violence often escalates gradually, with perpetrators testing boundaries and increasing control over time. Maybe the warning signs were things that seemed normal in context, I suggested. Marcus's need to know my schedule, his interest in my work, his suggestions about security improvements. If he'd been displaying obvious violence or aggression, I would have recognized the danger. That's what makes this so terrifying. He seemed like such a loving husband, always concerned about your safety and well-being. How do you protect yourself? From someone who hides their intentions so completely? The question was one I'd been grappling with myself. How do you maintain trust and intimacy in relationships while protecting yourself from people who might exploit that vulnerability? How do you recognize deception from someone who's spent years learning exactly how to manipulate you? I think the answer is trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't explain why, I said, and maintaining your independence and professional skills so you're not completely dependent on another person for your security. Helen nodded, wiping away tears that had been threatening throughout our conversation. I want you to know that I'll testify against Marcus if the prosecution needs me to. He's my son, and I love him. But I won't protect him from the consequences of trying to murder you. The offer of testimony from Marcus's own mother felt significant, though Robert Chen had indicated it probably wouldn't be necessary for the prosecution's case. Still, Helen's willingness to prioritize justice over family loyalty demonstrated the severity of Marcus's crimes even to those who'd loved him longest. 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, Catherine Mills requested another meeting to discuss plea negotiations. The prosecution's case had grown stronger as investigators uncovered additional evidence of Marcus's planning, including purchases of materials that could be used to stage accidents and detailed notes about my daily routines hidden in his office at Cascade Insurance. My client is prepared to plead guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for a sentence of 15 to 20 years with the possibility of parole after 12 years, Mills announced during the meeting in Robert Chen's office. That's not acceptable. Robert Chen replied immediately. Your client planned to murder his wife for financial gain over a period of months. The charges include attempted murder, and the sentence needs to reflect the severity of the intended crime. But Mr. Davidson never actually attempted to harm Mrs. Davidson. The conspiracy was discovered before any physical action was taken. That should be considered a mitigating factor. The only reason Marcus didn't follow through with his plan was that his wife discovered it and took steps to protect herself. He wasn't deterred by conscience or second thoughts. He was prevented by circumstances beyond his control. David and I had discussed the possibility of plea negotiations, weighing the certainty of a guilty plea against the potential for a harsher sentence if the case went to trial. A plea would spare me the ordeal of testifying and eliminate the risk that Marcus might be acquitted despite the evidence. But it would also deny me the opportunity to confront him publicly and ensure that the full extent of his planning was revealed in court. What kind of sentence are we talking about if Marcus is convicted at trial? I asked. Given the premeditation, the insurance fraud component, and the extensive planning, he could face 25 to 30 years without the possibility of parole for at least 15 years, Robert Chen explained. Amber would likely receive a lighter sentence as a co-conspirator rather than the primary perpetrator. I want to go to trial. Marcus planned my murder for months, acquired materials to carry it out, and would have killed me if I hadn't discovered his plan. He doesn't deserve a reduced sentence for being caught before he could act. The decision to reject the plea offer felt empowering, though it also meant committing to the emotional challenge of a public trial. I would have to testify about the most intimate details of my marriage, describe my discovery of Marcus's plot, and face cross-examination designed to undermine my credibility and character. Jury selection for the trial began on a gray Monday morning in late October, 6 months after I'd first discovered Marcus's plan to kill me. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious citizens, and family members from both sides. I sat behind the prosecution table, wearing a conservative blue suit that David's media consultant had suggested would project competence and trustworthiness. Catherine Mills used her jury challenges to eliminate potential jurors who worked in technology or law enforcement, presumably because they might be more sympathetic to my use of digital forensics to expose Marcus's crimes. Robert Chen focused on removing jurors who seemed skeptical of domestic violence claims or who expressed strong opinions about privacy rights in marriage. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 26 to 64. They included a retired teacher, a small business owner, 2 healthcare workers, a construction supervisor, and several office workers. None had extensive technology backgrounds, which concerned me slightly, but all had indicated they could evaluate digital evidence objectively. Judge Woodward's instructions to the jury emphasized the presumption of innocence and the prosecution's burden to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. She explained that the charges were serious and required careful consideration of both the evidence and the intent behind Marcus's actions. You will hear testimony about online searches, digital communications, and surveillance activities, Judge Woodward told the jurors. You must determine whether this evidence proves that the defendant intended to commit the crimes charged, or whether there are innocent explanations for his behavior. Robert Chen's opening statement laid out the prosecution's case with methodical precision, describing Marcus's research into killing me as a progression from general curiosity to specific planning. He showed the jury a timeline of Marcus's online activity, highlighting searches for untraceable poisons, staging household accidents, and life insurance investigation procedures. The evidence will show that Marcus Davidson spent months studying how to kill his wife without being caught, Robert Chen told the jury. He researched methods, acquired materials, surveilled his intended victim, and communicated with his co-conspirator about implementing their plan. This was not a moment of passion or a fantasy that got out of hand. This was calculated, premeditated, attempted murder, motivated by greed. Catherine Mills's opening statement painted a very different picture of Marcus as a devoted husband whose professional curiosity had been misinterpreted by a paranoid wife. She argued that his online searches were related to his work investigating insurance fraud and that his relationship with Amber was emotional rather than criminal. Marcus Davidson never harmed his wife, never threatened his wife, and never took any concrete steps toward harming his wife, Mills told the jury. What we have here is a marriage that was failing, a woman who discovered her husband's affair, and a twisted interpretation of innocent behavior designed to destroy a man's life out of spite. The contrast between the two narratives was stark, and I realized that the jury would need to decide not just whether Marcus was guilty, but what kind of person he actually was. The prosecution would present him as a calculating predator who'd planned my murder for financial gain. The defense would portray him as a flawed husband whose private thoughts had been weaponized against him by a vindictive ex-wife. As the trial began in earnest, I prepared myself for the most difficult period of my life since discovering Marcus's plot. Everything I'd learned about his planning, every detail of our marriage, and every aspect of my character would be scrutinized by strangers. The man who'd planned to kill me would sit just yards away, watching as his crimes were dissected in public. But I also felt ready for this confrontation. I'd spent months preparing emotionally and legally for this moment. I'd gathered overwhelming evidence of Marcus's intentions, survived his attempt to manipulate and eliminate me, and transformed myself from a potential victim into the key witness in his prosecution. The woman who'd once trusted blindly had become someone who verified everything and protected herself strategically. The trial would determine whether Marcus faced consequences proportionate to his crimes or whether he'd successfully manipulated the system one final time. But regardless of the outcome, I'd already achieved something important. I'd refused to be a victim, used my professional skills to expose the truth, and reclaimed control over my own narrative. The marriage was over, but my life was just beginning. Taking the witness stand felt like stepping into a spotlight that exposed every vulnerability and strength I'd developed over the past 8 months. The courtroom was silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system and the occasional rustle of papers. 12 jurors watched me intently as I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth about my husband's plan to murder me. Robert Chen began with basic questions about my background and marriage to Marcus, establishing a foundation before delving into the discovery that had shattered my world. I kept my voice steady and professional, drawing on the same composure I used when testifying in corporate fraud cases. The difference was that this time, I was discussing my own near-death rather than abstract digital evidence. Mrs. Davidson, can you describe what led you to examine your home network's activity in early March? Robert Chen asked. I was conducting a routine security audit when I noticed unusual traffic patterns from my husband's devices. As a cybersecurity professional, I investigate any anomalies that could indicate compromised systems or unauthorized access. What did you discover during this investigation? I found extensive research into methods of causing undetectable deaths, specifically focusing on household accidents that would appear natural. The searches included queries about untraceable poisons, staging falls, and creating electrical accidents. Robert Chen guided me through the timeline of discoveries, each revelation building toward the horrifying realization that Marcus had been planning my death for months. The jury listened intently as I described finding surveillance photos of myself, communications with Amber about implementing the murder plan, and evidence that Marcus had been testing methods of harming me in small doses. How did you feel when you realized the scope of your husband's planning? Robert Chen asked. Terrified, but also determined to protect myself and ensure he faced consequences for what he'd planned to do. My training taught me to document evidence thoroughly, so I focused on gathering proof rather than confronting him immediately. The prosecution's presentation of evidence was methodical and devastating. Digital forensics experts testified about the authentication of Marcus's search, history, and communications. Medical professionals explained how the substances he'd researched could cause death while appearing to result from natural causes. Financial analysts detailed the insurance policies and Marcus's attempts to hide assets before filing for divorce. When Catherine Mills began her cross-examination, her strategy became immediately clear. She intended to paint me as a paranoid, vindictive wife who'd weaponized my technical skills to destroy my husband after discovering his affair. Mrs. Davidson, isn't it true that you accessed your husband's private devices without his knowledge? Or consent? Mills asked, her tone suggesting this was somehow worse than planning murder. I monitored our home network for security purposes, which is standard practice for cybersecurity professionals. Marcus knew about my monitoring protocols. But you specifically targeted his personal communications and search history, didn't you? I investigated suspicious network activity that led me to discover criminal planning. Any competent cybersecurity professional would have done the same. Mills attempted to suggest that my interpretation of Marcus's research was influenced by discovering his relationship with Amber, that I'd twisted innocent professional curiosity into evidence of murder. Conspiracy out of jealousy and spite. Her questions were designed to make me appear emotional and unstable, but months of preparation with Dr. Martinez had taught me to stay focused on facts rather than feelings. Isn't it possible that Mr. Davidson's searches were related to his work as an insurance adjuster investigating accident claims? No, insurance adjusters investigate accidents after they occur to determine causation and liability. Marcus was researching how to cause accidents in ways that would avoid detection. The intent and application are completely different. But you admit that your marriage was troubled and that discovering his relationship with Ms. Hayes made you angry? I was angry about the affair, yes, but I was terrified about the murder plot. Those are distinct emotional responses to separate discoveries. Mills pressed harder, suggesting that I'd fabricated evidence using my technical expertise, that my access to law enforcement contacts had influenced the investigation, and that my financial motivation for divorce had colored my interpretation of innocent behavior. Each attack felt personal, but I maintained my professional demeanor while methodically refuting her implications. The prosecution's rebuttal was swift and decisive. Robert Chen presented additional evidence that had been held in reserve, including recordings of phone calls between Marcus and Amber discussing specific details of my murder. The conversations were chilling in their casual tone, discussing my death like a logistical problem to be solved rather than the ending of a human life. "The timeline doesn't work anymore, Marcus," Amber's voice said through the courtroom speakers. "She's been traveling less for work, and Mrs. Lane next door has been more observant lately. Maybe we need to consider the electrical option instead." "I've been thinking the same thing," Marcus replied. "The fuse box is in the basement, and Claire goes down there alone to check the security system every few days. An electrical accident would be completely believable given the age of the house." The jury's reaction to hearing Marcus casually discuss electrocuting me was immediate and visceral. Several jurors looked shocked, others appeared disgusted, and a few glanced at Marcus with obvious revulsion. The defense's narrative about innocent professional research crumbled in the face of recorded conversations about implementing specific murder methods. Amber's testimony as a prosecution witness, secured through a plea deal that reduced her charges in exchange for cooperation, provided devastating insight into the conspiracy. She described months of planning sessions where she and Marcus refined their approach, researched alibis, and calculated how long to wait after my death before beginning their relationship publicly. Marcus was very methodical about the planning, Amber testified, avoiding eye contact with Marcus throughout her testimony. He studied Claire's routines, tested different approaches, and researched how insurance companies investigate suspicious deaths. He wanted to make sure the plan was foolproof. "Did Mr. Davidson ever express doubt or reluctance about killing his wife?" Robert Chen asked. "No. He talked about it like a business decision that would solve multiple problems. He said, 'Claire would never agree to a divorce that gave him what he deserved, so this was the only way to build the life we wanted together.'" Catherine Mills's cross-examination of Amber was brutal, portraying her as a manipulative woman who'd seduced Marcus and convinced him to consider murder as a solution to his marital problems. But Amber's plea deal required complete honesty, and her detailed knowledge of the conspiracy supported the prosecution's case rather than undermining it. Marcus chose not to testify in his own defense, a decision that felt like both vindication and disappointment. I'd prepared for the possibility of facing him directly on the witness stand, of hearing him try to explain or justify his actions. His silence felt like a final act of cowardice, an unwillingness to account for his crimes even when facing their consequences. The closing arguments crystallized the competing narratives that had driven the entire trial. Robert Chen methodically reviewed the evidence of Marcus's planning, from his initial research through his acquisition of materials and his communications with Amber about implementation. The timeline was clear, the intent was documented, and the only reason I was alive to testify was my own detection of his plan. Marcus Davidson spent months studying how to kill his wife without being caught, Robert Chen told the jury. He researched methods, acquired materials, surveilled his intended victim, and discussed implementation with his co-conspirator. The only thing that prevented him from committing murder was his wife's discovery of his plan. That's not innocence. That's interrupted guilt. Catherine Mills made a final attempt to portray Marcus as a man whose private thoughts had been criminalized by an vindictive ex-wife, but her argument felt hollow after the jury had heard recorded conversations about my murder. She suggested that planning without action shouldn't carry the same penalties as completed crimes, but the evidence of Marcus's preparation was too extensive to dismiss as mere fantasy. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning their verdict. I sat between David and Robert Chen, trying to read the jurors' faces as they filed back into the courtroom. The foreman, a middle-aged construction supervisor, stood to deliver their decision with a gravity that made the entire courtroom hold its breath. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Marcus Davidson, guilty. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Marcus Davidson, guilty. On the charge of insurance fraud, we find the defendant, Marcus Davidson, guilty. Each guilty verdict felt like a weight being lifted from my chest. The jury had seen through the defense's attempts to minimize Marcus's crimes and had recognized the seriousness of his planning. Justice wasn't just being served, it was being served decisively. Marcus showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, maintaining the same detached expression he'd worn throughout the trial. Even facing the consequences of his crimes, he seemed incapable of genuine remorse or acknowledgement of what he'd planned to do to me. Judge Woodward scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, giving the probation department time to prepare their report and both sides to present arguments about appropriate punishment. The guilty verdicts meant Marcus would face significant prison time, but the exact length would depend on factors including his lack of criminal history and the extensive planning documented in the evidence. The media response to the verdicts was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive of the prosecution's case. Legal experts praised the thoroughness of the digital evidence and suggested that the case would set important precedents for prosecuting technology-enabled domestic violence. True crime podcasters analyzed every detail of the trial, turning my survival into entertainment for strangers who'd never faced such threats. I gave one carefully planned interview to Vanessa Torres, the journalist who'd approached me months earlier about writing a book. The conversation took place in my renovated living room, now stripped of all traces of my life with Marcus, and rebuilt as a space that belonged entirely to me. "What do you want people to understand about what happened to you?" Vanessa asked. "That domestic violence can take forms that aren't immediately recognizable as violence. Marcus never hit me, never threatened me directly, but he was planning to kill me for months. The signs were subtle enough that I lived with him every day without recognizing the danger. How has this experience changed your approach to relationships and trust?" "I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, even if I can't explain why. I've also learned the importance of maintaining my independence and professional skills. Those capabilities saved my life when I needed them most." The sentencing hearing brought closure to the legal proceedings, but opened new questions about how to move forward with my life. Marcus received 28 years in prison without the possibility of parole for 15 years. Judge Woodward's statement emphasized the premeditated nature of his crimes and the extensive planning that demonstrated clear intent to commit murder. Mr. Davidson used his professional knowledge and personal access to plan the murder of his wife for financial gain, Judge Woodward said. The only reason Mrs. Davidson is alive today is her own detection of his plan and her decisive action to protect herself. The sentence must reflect both the severity of the intended crime and the defendant's complete lack of remorse. Amber received 12 years in prison after her cooperation with the prosecution. Her sentence reflected her role as a co-conspirator rather than the primary perpetrator, but it still acknowledged her active participation in planning my murder. The house in Willowbrook sold within a month of Marcus's sentencing, bought by a young family who appreciated the renovations I'd made while erasing traces of my marriage. I used the proceeds to relocate to Portland, where I established a new cybersecurity consulting practice specializing in personal digital security for high-risk clients. The new business thrived beyond my expectations, drawing clients who'd learned about my case and wanted someone who understood how technology could be weaponized for intimate partner violence. I developed training programs for law enforcement on recognizing digital stalking and surveillance, turning my traumatic experience into expertise that helped other potential victims. Dr. Martinez had warned me that recovery from such profound betrayal would be measured in years rather than months. Some days were harder than others, particularly when media coverage reminded me of details I'd tried to forget, or when new clients shared stories that echoed my own experience. But each successful case, each person I helped protect themselves, felt like a victory over the man who'd tried to destroy me. Tommy Davidson stayed in contact, updating me occasionally on his brother's appeals and his mother's ongoing recovery from learning the truth about her son. Helen had entered therapy to process her grief and guilt, slowly accepting that Marcus's crimes weren't a reflection of her failure as a parent, but of choices he'd made as an adult. 2 years after the trial, I received an unexpected letter from Marcus in prison. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I found the courage to open it, afraid that even his written words might somehow manipulate or threaten me. The letter was shorter than I'd expected, and more chilling than any threat could have been. Claire, it read, I've had time to think about everything that happened, and I want you to know that I don't blame you for discovering my plans or for testifying against me. You were always smarter than I gave you credit for, and I should have anticipated that you'd eventually figure out what I was doing. I hope you're doing well in your new life. Marcus. The complete absence of remorse or acknowledgement of wrongdoing in his letter confirmed what I'd known during the trial. Marcus still saw my near murder as a problem to be solved rather than a crime he'd committed. He regretted being caught, not planning to kill me. Even facing the consequences of his actions, he remained fundamentally unchanged. I destroyed the letter immediately and asked my attorney to ensure that Marcus understood any further contact would constitute harassment. The man who'd once been my husband would spend the next 15 years in prison thinking about what he'd done, but he would never truly understand the harm he'd caused or feel genuine remorse for his crimes. 3 years after changing those locks at 2 a.m. and discovering that my marriage had been built on lies, I stood in my new office overlooking the Willamette River, reviewing security protocols for a client whose ex-boyfriend had been using technology to stalk her. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd found my calling by surviving someone else's attempt to destroy me. The woman who'd once trusted blindly had become someone who helped others verify what they suspected but feared to acknowledge. The wife who'd made excuses for suspicious behavior had become an expert at recognizing the warning signs that preceded violence. The potential victim had transformed into a guardian who helped others protect themselves from digital predators. Marcus had planned to eliminate me because he saw my intelligence and independence as obstacles to his goals. Instead, his attempt to destroy me had revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed, and led me to a life more fulfilling than any I could have imagined while trapped in his web of deception. The missing chair at that birthday dinner in Rome seemed like a lifetime ago, but it had taught me the most important lesson of my life. When someone shows you that you don't belong in their world, believe them. But more importantly, build your own world where you control who gets a seat at your table. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away from people who don't value your presence and build a life so compelling that their absence becomes irrelevant. Marcus had tried to write me out of existence, but instead, he'd helped me write the most important chapter of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.